In this section, we will consider a topic that there's a lot of discussion about: income inequality. That is, the gap between the rich and everyone else. Here are some important facts about income inequality in the U.S. The United States has long had a high degree of inequality of income. Second, the United States has long had the highest degree of income inequality among the developed capitalist countries. Third, the degree of income inequality in the U.S. rose sharply during the period starting around 1979 to 80, whereas it had declined during the previous period from 1948 to 1979. These are all facts about inequality that you will learn about in this section. The questions that we'll be interested in include: why is inequality in the U.S. so high, and why has it gotten higher? Is a high degree of inequality undesirable? Is it a problem that should be responded to? And at the end, we'll look into what it means to be rich. Not such an obvious concept as you might think. To measure inequality, it is common to use something called a quintile table. A quintile is 1/5, 20% of the population grouped by income level. A quintile table shows the percentage of total household income received by the poorest 20% of households, the next highest 20%, up to the richest 20%. Maximum equality would prevail if each quintile received 20% of total income. Maximum inequality would occur if the richest quintile got all the income and the other four got none. Income. What do we mean by income? Income is a flow of buying power from all sources received per unit time, per period. The main forms of income are wages, salaries, pensions, property income of various sorts from dividends and interest, government transfer payments. This slide shows some data about the distribution of income in the U.S., with the blue bars showing 1979 and the red bars 2016. In 1979, the poorest fifth of the population got 5.4% of the income, a little more than 1/4 of what complete equality would mean. The second, 11.6, the middle one, 17.5, the fourth fifth, 24.1, and the highest fifth got 41.4% of total, more than double what their equal share would be. Notice that this also includes the top 5%, which got 15%, 3 times what their share would be. Notice that by 2016, the income distribution had become more unequal. The poorest fifth got only 3.7%, a significant reduction. The second fifth got a smaller share, the third, the fourth, whereas the highest fifth got a substantially bigger share, and a big difference for the top 5%. I'll show you a famous graph that was produced by Piketty and Saez, a French economist and a Berkeley economist. This shows the share of income of the richest 1% and the richest 1/10 of 1% as a percentage of total income. In going back to 1920, they did a lot of work, those two, Piketty and Saez. In the 1920s, the top 1% got 24% of total income. Very high degree of inequality. Then, it fell after that, and in the period from the end of World War II through the late 70s, there was a fairly stable, about 10%. The top 1% had 10% instead of 24%. Then, right around 1980, the share of the top 1% began to rise. It had its bumps, but by 2007, the eve of the big financial crisis of 2008, it had risen almost to the level of the late 1920s, for the top 1/10 of 1%, it had risen even higher. This is interesting results that were made possible by getting Internal Revenue Service data to supplement the usual income distribution data. Key point is that a capitalist economy inevitably generates a high degree of inequality, which can be modified by actions of government and other actors, but the capitalist economy by itself generates a high degree of inequality. You can think of it as having two kinds of inequality: inequality between capitalists and workers, and inequality among workers. What about the first? In a capitalist economy, a small group owns the major means of production, the major enterprises, and the majority are wage earners who work for the capitalist. Thus, one capitalist is able to get surplus produced by many workers in the form of property income. Inequality among workers is also a fact of the way capitalist economy works. Wages depend mainly on the bargaining power of each group of workers in each occupation or each sector of the economy. Where bargaining power is high, workers will get higher wages, and where it's low, they'll get lower wages. And bargaining power varies greatly across the economy, leading to a big variation in wages and salaries that have nothing to do with merit or skill. Here are some high bargaining power occupations. Longshore workers, the people that load and unload ships. On the West Coast, where I happen to know the data, they make about $100,000 a year on average. Airline pilots have a lot of bargaining power. Those who operate heavy construction equipment and other highly paid workers. Star athletes. These are all, and of course with star athletes, it does have something to do with skill, but it's really skill without bargaining power doesn't get high income. Here are some low bargaining power occupations: restaurant workers, clerical workers, nursing home employees. Consider the contrast between a longshore worker who loads and unloads ships at the waterfront and a licensed practical nurse in a hospital. The licensed practical nurse needs more education, more skill, and makes a low income, while longshore workers who do not need a lot of education or skill earn a high income. It's a result of bargaining power. Bargaining power, in turn, is affected by various factors, particularly whether there's a strong labor union. It's affected by government programs. It's also affected by race and gender. The factors that tend to reduce income inequality in a country include government income maintenance programs, such as the minimum wage and unemployment compensation, which means if you are a low-wage worker, the wage can't be below a certain level, and if you lose your job, you'll still have some income. Having a large sector of public employees reduces inequality. Public employees in most countries are paid somewhat less than private sector employees, but the variation from the bottom to the top in the public sector is much narrower than in the private sector. A system of progressive income taxation that taxes the high income more heavily than low income also makes the after-tax income less unequal. Having strong labor unions also tends to reduce inequality. Not only do strong labor unions reduce somewhat the gap between labor and capital, but also there's strong evidence that strong labor unions benefit low-wage workers even more than medium and high-wage workers. Finally, a low unemployment rate benefits workers, particularly low-skilled workers. If they become in short supply, they will have a lot more bargaining power. So, with these understandings in mind, why is inequality in the US high compared to other countries? There are several factors. Government income maintenance programs are less generous and comprehensive in the United States than in most other developed countries. Public employment is lower relative to the total in the US, And labor unions are weaker and represent a smaller share of the labor force. These are all factors that help explain the difference. Why did inequality rise after 1979? After 1979, roughly, the factors that had been reducing inequality went into reverse. We'll examine the reasons for these changes in section 13 of the course on what is called social structures of accumulation. Here's some data to show these changes since around 1979 to 80. Here's the federal hourly minimum wage in constant 2011 dollars. You can see that after it hit a big high in the late 60s, but remained relatively high. Then in 1980, it started going down, and it has remained much lower than it had been. The top federal marginal tax rates. In the 1950s, people with income over a certain level had to pay 91.5% of their highest incomes in taxes to the federal government. That was still 60% through the late 70s, and since then it's fallen to about, well, in this graph it's about 28%. It's risen a little bit to 32% since then. And other forms of taxation on capital gains and corporate income have also fallen, other forms of income that accrue to high-income taxpayers. Here's union members as a percentage of all employees. After the early 80s, it has fallen steadily. Still another factor, the average unemployment rate. From 1949 to 73, the average unemployment rate was 4.8%, under 5%. After a period of instability in the 70s that we'll discuss later, when the unemployment rate was quite high, in the period since 1980 up to the big financial crisis of 2008, it was 6.1%. Two different periods with very different unemployment rates. A 6.1% unemployment rate may not look like that much more than 4.8%, but it makes a big difference in workers' bargaining power. They had a lot more bargaining power at a 4.8% unemployment rate. Now, there is actually a debate about whether inequality is a problem. Some argue it's a serious problem that should be remedied. Others argue that it's not a problem. We will look into the arguments for and against the view that income inequality is a problem that should be addressed. We will also look into what it means to be rich, what it means for a society to have some people who are rich. Does it just mean that some people have a lot of money, which they can use to buy whatever they want? Or does it also mean that some people have a lot of power over other people? Last, we will consider equal opportunity, the perfection of equal opportunity as a means to assure a fair society. We'll consider whether pursuit of the goal of equal opportunity is enough to assure economic justice. Thank you.